Power, read by Andrew Sachs.
We rarely encounter hatred. We say that we hate parsnips or we hate washing up. But real hatred, that hatred which, like some malignant infection, enters one's being, destroying love, kindness, sympathy, care, understanding, generosity, every benign emotion, and then attacks reason itself, that is a terrible thing. And that is what George knowingly and willingly cultivated. His dull, lifeless marriage had long since lost such ardour as it had ever had. Mrs. George, as he called her, cooked for him, did his washing, kept the house clean. She received her housekeeping money each Friday, and occasional cash for her other needs, tickets for the theatre with Mrs. McCurdle, a summer coat, a winter coat, whatever. Not every man is so well blessed. But George couldn't see it that way. He could have done what other men did, gone to football, watched the telly, dropped off to sleep, lifted his elbow at the King's Head more often, even had a bit on the side with a complacent barmaid. He could have counted his blessings, but he didn't. He could even have taken a look at that old wedding photograph and asked how that fresh, smiling, happy young girl had turned into Mrs. George, and if his own indifference had anything to do with the change. George did none of these things. He was a man who cherished a grievance until it turned to hatred, by which time he had but one object in life: to get rid of Mrs. George without being found out. He pondered and pondered, took his time, living only for the day. But how? One thing was clear. Poisoning and burial in the back garden was asking for trouble. Better a blow from a blunt instrument on a dark night in a strange place. But exactly how and where? Then he had an idea. 3 or 4 times a year, Mrs. George visited her sister, and 3 or 4 times a year, George went travelling. Here was his alibi. When she was killed in Essex, he would be miles away in Hertfordshire. With the right route and roads fairly free of traffic, it would not be difficult to nip across and do the deed without exciting suspicion. That was the where, but the how? No problem, when he came to think of it. The sister lived in a quiet little town on the Thames estuary. Just beyond the town was a pretty little walk, and Mrs. George, a great believer in a breath of fresh air before retiring, never missed it. Her sister stayed in to watch telly. The more George thought about the plan, the better he liked it. And so George waited until a month later, when Mrs. George went visiting and he went travelling. On the second night he moved. All systems at go, he crouched in a clump of bushes with his blunt instrument at the ready. But no Mrs. George. He shrugged his shoulders and hurried back to the inn. He had one bit of luck. As he tiptoed up the stairs, he ran into the landlord, who was making for the bathroom. The landlord gave him a knowing wink and said, "Which one? That widow over at Elmcombe?" George looked shocked and said, "Please. The choir practice overran." "It always does when one of my regulars wants a front door key." He had strengthened his alibi. The landlord would never suspect him. The failure of his first attempt was neither here nor there. Here's to the next time. We may wonder if Mrs. George had suspicions. Never a conversationalist, he was now noticeably withdrawn. He no longer bothered to complain when his blue shirt was not washed. And one night, as she sat by the fire with her needlework, she saw him looking at her. It wasn't a pleasant look, and when he saw that she was watching him, he hastily returned to his newspaper. None of this escaped Mrs. George. She was no fool. Was she wise to his game? Prepared? Ready? Waiting to use her rolling pin if the need arose? He had his second chance 2 months later. It was a nasty night. Tense with fear, He shivered as the fine rain systematically wetted him, fearful that an involuntary sneeze would spoil everything. But again she didn't turn up. It was frustrating, but he had a plan, a foolproof one, and he wouldn't change it. He must bide his time. 4 months later he set out on the now familiar journey. Once again he was in position, just off the footpath, hidden in a clump of bushes. The minutes ticked by. His pulse was racing, his heart beating like the thudding of a steam hammer. Would she arrive? Would she arrive? Could he finish her off this time once and for all? Scarcely daring to breathe, he strained to hear her footsteps. He tensed at a sound. Was it? Was it? Yes, it was. You can always tell a person by the walk, and this was she, the sharp clip of her heels and the curious rhythm of her pompous strut. But there was a snag. She was coming from the wrong direction. He was positioned in the bushes with his back to her. He daren't move. If he so much as rustled the bushes, she'd run away, screaming at the top of her voice. He took a grip of himself, not to panic. It'd be all right. Immobile, yet ready to spring, he crouched in the bushes for the kill. He could now see her out of the corner of his eye. She was looking the other way. There was no mistaking her. The stocky, dumpy figure, the dowdy clothes, the antique hat. All his hatred welled up in him as he leapt forward and hit her. As she staggered, he gave it a push, and the next moment she was in the river. He closed his eyes. He dared not look on her face. He couldn't bear to see her lying on the water, her vacant eyes staring at him, accusing him. When he opened his eyes, she was gone, to the bottom of the river, lying in the mud. But in his imagination he could see her face, a stark face with cold, staring eyes, a face from the grave. He squared his shoulders, put his blunt instrument back in its plastic bag, and made for his car. He drove back like a man in a dream. Sleep came quickly. He was tired and exhausted. But it wasn't refreshing sleep. On and off he twisted and turned, troubled with vague dreams. At 4 o'clock he awoke with a start, sweating, trembling, crazed with fear. He'd had a terrible dream. He had dreamt that he had killed his wife with a blunt instrument. He saw himself push her into a river. He saw the terrible look on her face as slowly she disappeared. And then he sprang out of bed in a panic. It wasn't a dream. He had killed her. He had killed his wife. His foolproof plan had a fatal defect. The killing was easy. He wasn't going to get found out. But the plan didn't allow for living with himself after he'd done the deed. He started to dress, but checked himself. He couldn't go out at this time of night. It would create suspicion. He couldn't even pace about his room. That might create suspicion. For the next 3 hours, his room was a prison cell. It suddenly dawned on him that he'd built a prison cell of his own, in his mind, and there might be no getting out of that one till the day he died. He did manage to get a couple of hours' real sleep, and appeared at breakfast, outwardly bright and smiling, paid his bill, and went on his way. He couldn't resist looking in the boot of his car, but his blunt instrument was there all right. It wasn't part of a dream. Work occupied his mind during the day, but he had to face reality when he got home. His plan wasn't as safe as it had seemed. He had lost his works identification label with his photograph and his name on it. Where had he lost it? Had it fallen out of his pocket by the river bank? If so, they couldn't miss it when they dragged the river, and that would demolish his alibi. Would he get away with it? And if not, what? 10 years? 20 years? But he had a more immediate problem. Loving husbands ring their absent wives every night. He hadn't. Why hadn't he? And when she didn't come back, her sister should have phoned and told him. Why hadn't she? Was something going on he didn't know about? And Mrs. McCurdle? How long before she asked questions? But he was missing the biggest mystery of all. Why wasn't the murder on the news, plastered over all the evening papers? And why weren't the reporters and the television cameras besieging the house, demanding interviews? Something was wrong. He was in trouble. Any action might make matters worse. He could only sit tight. And still he pondered. The sister must know that Mrs. George had disappeared. Why the silence? Why hadn't she gone to the police? Why weren't the police dragging the river? She must have a reason for concealing the death. He would call her bluff. Uncertainly, he picked up the phone. If the sister answered, he could still slam down the receiver. But the sister didn't answer. He'd got the right number, but not the sister. The house had been sold 3 months ago, and the new owner had just moved in. No, only one lady had moved out, the old owner, and she and her sister had bought a boarding house in Devon. At that point, the woman became suspicious and cut off. Mystery on mystery. It had taken 3 months to sell the house, so Mrs. George knew about it. But did she ever get to Devon? Had the sister been by the river, behind him, when the murder was committed? Had she profited from Mrs. George's death by taking over the boarding house for her own? The days went by, and his questions remained unanswered. But when that gossiping busybody Mrs. McCurdle knocked on his door, he told her, "I'm sorry, my wife has gone away. She's left me." It took the wind out of her sails, so clearly she knew nothing of the boarding house in Devon. But that didn't stop her making a mystery of his wife's disappearance, and when facts failed her, she drew on her imagination. She called attention to Mrs. George's disappearance and told the police that, in her view, her mortal remains would be found in the garden. The inspector sighed. Mortal remains found in gardens were the flavour of the month these days, and a stiff spell of digging might reveal no more than the remains of a ginger Tom who died of natural causes. But Mrs. McCurdle's views, now common knowledge, sent George into vertical takeoff. He knew that mortal remains in gardens are 2 a penny these days. No self-respecting garden lacks a good corpse. And there might be one in his garden, put there by a former resident. He didn't mind serving 10 years for the murder of Mrs. George, but what irony if he went to jail for an entirely different murder. But they didn't start digging. They had nothing to go on. Half-hearted inquiries dragged on for month after month, but though the police once questioned George, they never took him in. Thus it became apparent they were going to get nowhere. George began to shed his despondency. The murder was all in the past, and he was off the hook. Then assurance became doubly certain. He found his work's identification label behind the cushion in his armchair. And that was that. He was all right. It was a short step from there to believe what he wanted to believe, that he hadn't killed anyone. He examined his blunt instrument still in the garage. There was no blood on it, so he couldn't have used it. He'd chop it up and put it on a bonfire next Saturday. Granted, he had, under intense provocation, taken an extreme view of Mrs. George's conduct towards him, but kill her? Well, certainly not. No, it was all a bad dream. He soon got back into the swing of life. He resumed his visits to the King's Head, where the barmaid smiled on him once more. He engaged a lady to sweep and clean and wash up twice a week, and leave a juicy joint roasting in the oven. Life was good. It took on a new, vibrant dimension. He was living as he had always wanted to live, until that letter arrived. It was a Friday. The toils of the week were over. The house was spick and span, and the smell of his cleaning lady's cooking was getting his digestive juices working. He shed his car coat, poured himself a glass of sherry, and settled down to glance through the post. A couple of circulars, a bill, a charitable appeal, a card with a dental appointment, and then an official-looking letter postmarked Taunton. He didn't like the look of it one bit, the less so when he opened it. It was a letter from a solicitor, short and to the point, saying that his client, Mrs. George, wanted a divorce as soon as possible. Had George been reasonable, had he stopped to think, he would have agreed like a shot and his troubles would have been over. He hadn't killed Mrs. George, and everything pointed to the fact that the person he had killed was a lonely old woman in whose empty flat, even Now there was a pile of final rent notices on the doormat, a pile that would grow for perhaps another 2 years before the landlords finally broke in and concluded that she had long since done a moonlight flit. But that hatred which had landed George in so much trouble was still with him, and wouldn't let him go. So, Mrs. George was alive. She had gone with her sister to run the boarding house. They'd contrived to let him think her dead, and now she'd returned from the dead to vex him once more. How he wished it was her he had finished off that time with his blunt instrument. More than that, she had opened up another worry. If he hadn't killed Mrs. George, and he hadn't killed her sister, who had he killed? Some harmless, lonely old soul whose death had passed unnoticed. Perhaps with cynical scorn they had stood on the footpath and seen it all happen, even rejoicing that what he had done would haunt and taunt him when he found a happiness he never knew before. He leapt from his chair, and leaving his sherry and the waiting meal, charged hatless and coatless into the night. He walked and walked and walked, rapidly and without purpose, until sheer physical exhaustion slowed him down. Only then was he aware of the world around him. He stopped and looked. He was on the Albert Embankment. He leant against the parapet and gazed at the river. It was high tide. The river was silky in the moonlight and flowing rapidly to the sea. It fascinated him. The water that was coursing before his eyes was hurrying to that spot by the footpath where the remains of the unknown, forgotten woman was embedded in the mud. For the first time he felt something which might have been remorse and even compassion. But he had no kind thoughts for that arch-tormentor, Mrs. George. Conflicting emotions engulfed him as he gazed at the swift-flowing stream. He faced the ugliness of his situation and pondered on a solution. Should he leap over the parapet and join the woman he had treated so badly, his own executioner? If he did that, he would relieve Mrs. George of the need of a divorce. If he floated out to sea, never to be seen again, she would face the long-drawn-out business of getting presumption of his death. Would suspicion even be cast on her? Either way, Mrs. George would destroy the compassion which was prompting him to jump. As he stands there, torn by conflicting desires and emotions, a cloud hides the moon, and a mist from the sea blots out what little can be seen of this tragic figure. Heaven help him.